All right. Play nice, children. All right. Welcome back. So we are towards the end of the lesson six packet. We'll see how far we get. The lesson seven packets are printed and on the chair back there. So if we do get on to lesson seven, they are available. But we are still in the last chapter of Ruth, really slowing down and digging into everything that's happening as everything gets resolved. So again, lesson six is verses 7 through 12. Now, this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." Um, Before we jump, I guess I'll get into the question from last week. So the question was asked, um, because Boaz is kind of doing the Levirate marriage thing, and he marries Ruth, and their heir is going to perpetuate the line of Elimelech and Mahlon, why does the credit go to Boaz as the father in the genealogies, both in the end of Ruth, as well as in Matthew and Luke, when we're getting the genealogy of Christ? So I did look up in my commentary. I have the full write up here if anyone wants to read it later. Um, but essentially, it's perfectly fair and normal for the Hebrew genealogies for it to credit Boaz as the father of Obed because he is the biological father. Um, and there's two reasons why this is legitimate. One is because it's not strictly a Levirate marriage because Boaz was not the brother of Elimelech. He's a relative, and so he's able to kind of invoke this same principle, but it's not a direct Levirate marriage because that is strictly between brothers. That's what Levirate actually means. Um, so it still works where legally Obed is going to be considered the heir of Elimelech and Mahlon, and the land will remain in his name according to his family name. Um, it's perfectly fine and normal to recognize that Boaz is the father biologically. The other reason is that in cases of levirate marriages, if even though legally you count as a descendant of the deceased, it was not unheard of if the Redeemer had a better prestige or family name for the child to, in regular life, choose the other person's name for the extra social credit that would afford him. Um, I don't know how Boaz compares to Elimelech in terms of family honor, but we know Boaz is recognized as a worthy man. Everyone seems to like him. And so it would be it's not unprecedented for Boaz to live his life as the son of Obed and get that family credit from Obed, or for Obed to claim himself as the son of Boaz and get that social credit from being the son of Boaz rather than that of Elimelech, even though, again, legally he still counts as the heir of Elimelech and inherits the land. Um, and so, yeah, as the genealogies go, they seem to just be going by blood, and because biologically he is the son of Boaz, that's what they're recognizing, even though in terms of inheritance law and legal talk, he would be recognized as the heir of Elimelech and Mahlon for the purposes of land inheritance. Does that make sense? All right. Hmm? Right. Yeah. So Boaz bought the land back. Um, so again, this is right. Well, yeah, he the language says from Naomi, but it's the idea is on behalf of Naomi. So it's recognizing that Naomi, as the widow of Elimelech, I guess, was selling the land in the way that you sold the land rights and all of that. And so Boaz is buying it back for her, but it's still recognizing that a land transaction has taken place. So in a way, it's recognizing that in the big picture, it's Elimelech sold the land to somebody, and now Boaz is buying the land back and then giving it to Naomi through the heir. And in a way, it's just kind of cutting out that middleman. So instead of saying Elimelech sold it to this person, then Boaz bought it and gives it back to Naomi, they're saying it's as if this person never actually bought the land, and Boaz is the one who's purchasing the land, so he can turn around and give it back to her. So it's recognizing the land transaction has taken place. And to a certain extent, he's going to get harvesting rights of the land, because until Ruth bears an heir to inherit it, he does get the rights to it. So in that sense, he's buying it from her. But it's all with this, again, with that announcement to the unnamed Redeemer that he's going to marry Ruth and uphold this lever ideal of keeping it in that family name. He's not really buying the land for himself in perpetuity. He's buying it to be a steward over it until he and Ruth can produce an heir who will inherit it. Is that, yeah. Again, I am not an expert in 15th century BC legal land property rights, but that's as I understand it to be working. All right, so we are on question 13 of the lesson 6 packet. How did the elders and the people respond to Boaz's announcement? $13. How did the elders and the people respond to Boaz's announcement? Yeah, they seem pretty excited about it all. All the people who are at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make this woman who's coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem, and may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring the Lord will give you by this young woman." So they're gung ho. They're all for it. And again, if you look back in chapters 2 and 3, we see Boaz seems to be pretty well respected in his community. Ruth is apparently pretty well respected in the community. Everyone knows everything she did on behalf of Naomi. She seems to be well liked. So everyone loves a wedding, and they really love a wedding when they like the bride and the groom. And so I don't know necessarily in this period, but that's probably fair to say. A wedding is a pretty big multi-day event with feasting. So yeah, everyone's excited for a wedding anyway. Yeah, it's party time. That makes sense. But yeah, everyone loves a wedding, and again, from what we can tell, the reputation, people really seem to like Boaz and Ruth, so they're even more excited about that. So they're already heaping blessings upon Ruth, and wishing her lots of good offspring. Which brings us to 14. What blessing did they pronounce on Ruth? I just kind of said that, but so yeah. So what they say to Ruth is, "May the Lord make the woman who's coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem." So they're wishing fame and fortune and lots of offspring for Ruth, essentially. Because question 15 brings us to, what were Leah and Rachel known for? Right, lots of kids. So references to Genesis are listed there, but Rachel and Leah were the wives of Jacob, who helped produce the 12 patriarchs of Israel, their handmaids also get involved too, because it's that wonderfully messed up family dynamic that we talked about towards the beginning of this study. But again, it's sort of like the levirate marriage thing. Giving your handmaid to your husband was a way to legally have children if you yourself were barren. So even though biologically they would be children of your handmaid, because it's your handmaid, legally they count as your kid, and for all intents and purposes, they count as your offspring. It's the surrogacy of the day. So Rachel and Leah get into this like child having competition with each other, and they each bring in a handmaid to try to get one leg up on the other. So Jacob ends up begetting children with 4 different women, but legally the mothers are recognized as Rachel and Leah because the other 2 were handmaids to Rachel and Leah. And so across these 4 women, you get the 12 tribes of Israel, or the patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel. And so when they wish that she would be like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel, they're saying, hey, I hope you have a whole lot of kids and that they grow up to be maybe not a mighty nation, because they're already the nation of Israel, but that idea of being great in number and power and influence and that sort of thing. Yeah. All right. So then 16, we're going to cross over to Psalms 127 and 128 and look for, they're short, don't worry, look for verses that seem to follow along with that same sort of blessing. Psalm 127 and 128. So 127, I'm just going to give you the answer because that's what I do. 127 verses 3 to 5 say, behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows, arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. So it's the same sort of blessing. Lots of kids are a blessing from the Lord. They're wishing blessings upon Ruth. I know having kids is kind of a double-edged sword because of the pain of childbirth, but the end result of having lots of kids is good. It's a blessing from God. It's a recognition that God is there helping your family grow, and He's giving you this awesome responsibility of raising up the next generation. And it's worth noting that Psalm 127 is where we get the name of the Quiverful movement, if you're aware of that. That's the Duggar family who have like 27 kids or whatever. And it's like a sect, I guess. But they really take this 127 to heart. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. So that's where they get the name Quiverful. Having your quiver full means having lots and lots of kids. So the Quiverful movement is this idea that you're supposed to have as many kids as humanly possible, which is why the Duggars have 27 kids or whatever their number is. Yeah, they probably did. Although the big Catholic family is not necessarily because of this verse. Like they don't necessarily see it as a mandate to have as many kids as possible. That's what the Quiverful does. They're kind of like Mormons in that way. The stereotypical big Catholic family is because they oppose any form of contraception, and that's just kind of nature that taking its course. And then people are like, "Oh, Catholics are so uptight," and it's like, "Do you know how those kids are made?" Yeah. Up until like early 1900s, I think the Lutheran tradition was pretty much opposed to all forms of contraception too. So um, that's something to think about. And then 128, verses 3 to 4 and 6. Your wife will be like a fruitful vine within your house. Your children will be like olive shoots around your table. Behold, thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord. May you see your children's children. Peace be upon Israel. So again, recognizing that having lots of kids is a blessing. Thus shall a man be blessed when his wife is like a fruitful vine and your children are like olive shoots around the table. May you see your children's children in recognition not only that you have lots of kids, but then your kids have lots of kids, and you, again, have this nice big family of influence on the next generation. Um, yes. Yeah, I'd heard Russia was doing that. I hadn't heard that in China, but yeah, um, yeah, China is reaping the benefits of telling everyone that children are a burden and you need to resist overpopulation. And they had the whole one child policy for forever. And then they started looking around and they're like, we got like 6 guys for every girl. This is not very good for our replacement numbers. Everyone started having more kids. And so then they moved, I think they bumped up to like 2 and then 3 children. But they had spent so long pushing this one child policy onto the culture, even when they said, hey, you can have 3 kids now. Like people didn't want to because they grew up their whole life thinking, oh, all families should only have 1 kid. And so their issues are, yeah, they're, I mean, this is what's happening in a lot of countries. It's really bad in Japan. Um, yeah. Yeah, and it, yeah, yeah. A lot of the Western nations were not really at replacement numbers to keep us going, and so we've, in our wonderful 20th century push for family planning and contraception and wait until you're absolutely ready to have a kid instead of letting nature take its course. And of course, all the abortion advocates have a big role in this too. Um, a lot of Western nations and China and Japan have put themselves in this situation where people have been given this cultural mindset where you're not supposed to have a lot of kids, and now our countries are not meeting replacement numbers. And so we're all getting into this wonderful place where immigration is becoming necessary just to keep your society alive because you need to get more working bodies, and your citizens aren't having enough kids to produce those working bodies, and now you have to import people from the global south to try to keep your numbers up and keep your social security systems afloat. Um, Italy's really bad at this too because which is funny because you think Italy should all be Catholic and they should all have huge families. But yeah, I forget what the stats are, but Italy has a really, really large retired population, which is part of why COVID hit them so hard, and a really, really low birth rate. And that's getting close to collapsing everything there too. But yeah, so now you have nations like China and I think Russia, and I wouldn't be surprised if other nations started to do this, where they start offering financial incentives to people to start to have more kids because they got to do something to try to reverse the last 50, 60, 70 years of social engineering and pushing only have 1 kid on everybody. Um, so yeah, sometimes when humanity decides it knows what's best, it kind of destroys its civilization, and you have to go back to what God says about how children are being a blessing, and we should have been having more kids all along. Seems like God knows what He's doing when He talks about stuff. Yeah. Yeah, and that, yeah, it's, yeah, but yeah, it's this combination of well, you had the big, oh, the world's getting overpopulated, everyone stop having kids scare that happened in like the 60s or 70s, whenever that was. You've got all of the greed and the selfishness of the 80s saying, oh, I don't want to have kids because there goes all my disposable income. I'd rather travel the world by myself because that'll be more fulfilling when I'm 80 and sitting in a retirement home and I don't have anyone to come and visit me. You and yeah, now the big thing is, humans are the disease of the planet. Anytime you have a kid, that's like a billion pounds of carbon dioxide that's going to be released in their lifetime. So the best thing you can do for the environment is to not have kids, just have cats and dogs and treat them as your kids. Yeah, I don't know cows. I don't know. You've got, I want to say it's Facebook, but that could be a bias. But there's some company that's like introducing the idea of making virtual reality babies so that you can like put on a headset and pretend you're interacting with a child and get all of the satisfaction of having a kid without actually making a kid who's going to be so bad for the environment. Um, yeah, so our culture, again, once you depart from God and His universal truth as society, you go into eldritch horrors beyond your comprehension. But yeah, we've completely thrown off the idea of what having children is. That children have been turned into a luxury item for rich people who can afford to spoil them, and they won't have to give up their lifestyle because they can just hire nannies to take care of the kids or whatever. The whole surrogacy industry is the idea of, oh, you want a kid, but you don't want to have to make any personal sacrifices for your kid. So instead of you actually enduring a pregnancy and having bodily changes, you'll just pay some other woman to do it for you, which is bizarre when you really think about it. Or you've got all the homosexual couples who are just custom ordering them. Pete Buttigieg and his husband, who have maternity shoots of the two of them sitting on a hospital bed holding the twins that they bought from somebody, and everyone else is like, where is the mother who delivered those babies? No, she doesn't get any credit. She doesn't count. You don't want those kids to have their mother growing up? That's cool. Yeah, we're in a clown world. um, mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Kids. Um, I'm sorry. There's a whole lot of jokes we make about this sort of thing in the seminary, and I'm trying to stay clean. Yeah. 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 For the yeah. Well, let's get us removed from YouTube. For the Mormons, they think that God and His wives are, because God has a wife in Mormonism. They're always having sex in heaven, and they're making spirit babies, and spirit babies need to have a physical body to inhabit so that they can grow and learn what it's like to be physical. Because in Mormonism, they do a weird reverse Gnosticism thing where we all start as spirits, but having a body is actually better. And so that's why God created Adam in the first place, because we all existed as His spirit babies before, and then He makes Adam so we can have a physical experience. And so God is continually having sex and making lots and lots of spirit babies, and He needs bodies to put those spirit babies into. So as a Mormon, it's your job to make a lot of babies that He can put those spirits into so that they can experience a physical existence, and then they can ascend to godhood themselves. Which, yeah, weird. And again, like, people hearing that, like, people hearing that in the 1800s, and they're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's a perfectly reasonable religion. Let's go follow this one instead. I don't understand how that happened. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that like yeah, like this is what we've been talking about in the Proverbs study of all this stuff, talking about the interaction between parents and children, and the responsibility of the parents to teach the children up in the way that they ought to go. Part of having children is to impart this wisdom upon them, so that it's not lost to the sands of time. Because again, those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it, and those who are never given the opportunity to learn history can't study it. So there is this responsibility to bring up the next generation. And one way or another, the next generation is going to come. Wouldn't it be better if the next generation was coming from people who are in the church? I recognize that people do convert into Christianity, but it would be a lot more efficient if we could just raise them as Christians in the first place. As the common phrase goes, if your church isn't crying, it's dying. We do get visitors from time to time, but really the best way to keep a congregation going is if everyone in the congregation is having kids and you're perpetuating yourself. And like, yeah, you grow as people join you, but it's really hard to have a self-sustaining model just in bringing in converts, especially if you're in an area that's already somewhat established and you have lots of other churches. Like my understanding is like Fallon is a fairly religious city. We don't have a lot of atheists to convert to Lutheranism. It's just a lot of them go to the Baptist church, the non-denom church, or the Mormon temple. Yeah, one of the three. But yeah, that's why I'm not going to complain if a baby is crying in church, because I'm just happy we have a baby in the church. I'm working on my part, guys. But yeah, this Pastor Fisk has a video, or because somebody asked him about the idea of contraception, and this idea that again, in Lutheranism we were pretty opposed to contraception until like the early 1900s, and that started to change. And Pastor Fisk is just like, how much barrenness do you want? Look through the scriptures. Children are a blessing. Why are you going out of your way to try to deny this blessing? Look at what's happened to the church after 100 years of us diminishing our own birth rates because we're buying into this cultural narrative that kids are a burden, and you have to like make sure you reach a certain level before you like a certain level of economic income or whatever before you have kids, instead of making sacrifice for them and figuring out ways to make it work. Yeah, it's not been great for the church. The average age of the LCMS congregations just keeps climbing every year, and you need to start having, I know maybe the wrong group to be talking to, but yeah, as a whole, we need to be having more kids as much as possible. Yeah, sorry guys. I don't mean to be rude. It's just, yeah. So yeah, the cultural narrative around kids is just messed up because we're in a clan world and nobody knows what anything's actually for. And then the church is just like trying to tell everyone, but everyone just ignores us, and yeah, it's dumb. This has been a cheery morning. All right, any more questions on 16 then? All right, 17. We are told that Rachel died in childbirth when her last son was born. Where was she buried, and what was her last child's name? Reference to Genesis 35. 18 through 20. And as her soul was departing, for she was dying, she called his name Ben-Oni, but his father called him Benjamin. So Rachel died, and she was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. And Jacob set up a pillar over her tomb. It is the pillar of Rachel's tomb, which is there to this day. Hmm? Yeah, it says he put a pillar. Jacob set up a pillar over her tomb. Yeah, yeah. To this day is when this gets written. So yeah, Moses writes Genesis around 1500 BC ish. I don't know the exact dates, but traditionally it's around 1500 BC. Abraham, I think, is around 3000. Don't quote me on the dates for Abraham. I don't remember. But yeah, presumably as Moses is writing Genesis, the pillar was still there, and they recognized it was there based on the oral tradition that they had been passing down to each other. So he's making that note that it was still there in some way, shape, or form. It may not still be standing today, but when Genesis was penned, it was still standing. Mm-hmm. Basalt? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, it's very hard to build in Israel because anytime you try to get a permit, you find out you're on an archaeologically significant site. Yeah. Um, but yeah. So, where was Rachel buried, and what was the child's name? No, in Bethlehem. Yeah, she was buried on the way to Ephrath, and then in parentheses, that is Bethlehem. Um, so somewhere she's buried somewhere in the region of Bethlehem. So again, even though it's a small city, it does have historical significance based on what happens around there. And Ephrath is kind of the next major city next to Bethlehem, and over time they end up kind of getting merged together, so that by the time you get to um, Micah, I always confuse Micah and Malachi in my head, but I'm pretty sure it's Micah, where the Bethlehem is prophesied as the place of Jesus' birth. In Micah, it calls it Bethlehem Ephrathah. They've been merged kind of into one city. But at the time, Bethlehem and Ephrath were somewhat distant, but Ephrath was still the major city. So the people from Bethlehem would consider themselves Ephrathites, because Ephrath is kind of the nation around it to try to comport modern terminology into their geography. So they're journeying to Ephrath, and along the way, she dies, and they bury her in Bethlehem. And she names her son as she's dying Ben-Oni, which, if you look in your footnote there, could mean son of sorrow or possibly son of my strength. Given that she's dying and she's naming him, I think the people are more likely to think it's son of my sorrow. because then Jacob changes it to Benjamin, which is kind of a jerk move to change your kid's name after your dying wife names him and then she's dead and then you change his name. But if you look in the Lutheran Study Bible, I believe it makes the note that was probably Abraham, like not wanting to look at Benjamin and constantly be reminded of his mother's death every time he looks at him, because your mom, if she dies giving birth to him and in her dying breath, she's like, name him son of my sorrow. And then the rest of your life, you're like, son of my sorrow, you killed my favorite wife. That's not going to help your family dynamic. So he changes his name to Benjamin, which, if you're pronouncing in the Hebrew, is closer to how you pronounce Ben-Oni. So it's not a huge change. It still sounds similar. But Benjamin means son of my right hand. And so he's keeping the name kind of close, but changing it a little bit so that's not as much of a reminder of Rachel's death. And then you get into some wonderful irony later on in the book of Judges with Ehud, because he was a Benjaminite. And again, Benjamin means son of my right hand, and Ehud was left-handed. That's kind of his whole thing. So yeah, it's ironic. I really love Ehud. It's one of my favorite stories. All right, any other thoughts on 17? Sorry, I'm getting really off track right now. All right, 18. What part did Rachel's last child play in the building of the house of Israel? Reference to 1 Samuel 10, 17 through 24. Now Samuel called the people together to the Lord at Mizpah, and he said to the people of Israel, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I brought up Israel out of Egypt, and I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from all the hand of the kingdoms that were oppressing you. But today you have rejected your God, who saves you from all your calamities and your distresses, and you have said to him, Set a king over us. Now therefore present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your thousands. Then Samuel brought all the tribes of Israel near, and the tribe of Benjamin was taken by lot. He brought the tribe of Benjamin near by its clans, and the clan of the Matrites was taken by Lot, and Saul the son of Kish was taken by Lot. But when they sought him, he could not be found. So they inquired again of the Lord, Is there a man still to come? And the Lord said, Behold, he has hidden himself among the baggage. Then they ran and took him from there, and when he stood among the people, he was taller than any of the people from his shoulders upward. And Samuel said to all the people, Do you see him whom the Lord has chosen? There is none like him among all the people. And all the people shouted, Long live the king. So, what part does Benjamin play in the building of Israel? Big picture. You're on the right track. One specific man who was taller. No. Goliath's a Philistine. No, David's from Judah. Not Samson. Samson might have been a Benjaminite. I don't remember off the top of my head. Right, so King Saul comes from the tribe of Benjamin. So yeah, could have phrased this question better. But King Saul, who is the first king for Israel, comes from the tribe of Benjamin. He begins the process of unifying the tribes into a united kingdom. David is the one who finishes uniting them all under his kingship, but Saul begins the process. He's the first of the monarchs, so he has his own unique place in history. And then as you continue down the history of the Old Testament into the New Testament, Benjamin and Judah were the two tribes in the south. So when the kingdoms split into the northern kingdom and Judah, the southern kingdoms were called Judah just because that was the Davidic line was of the tribe of Judah, and Judah was the larger nation. But the southern kingdom was actually Judah and Benjamin. So in the northern kingdom, you have the 10 tribes that get lost in the Assyrian exile. And so what remains of Judah, which then become the Jews in the New Testament, are really Judah and Benjamin, and whatever Levites were living among them. But the Levites didn't have their own land, so that becomes the whole thing too. And so by the time you get to the New Testament, they're all called Jews because Judah, but they're just as many from the tribe of Benjamin as well. And another Saul, who then becomes Paul, is also from the tribe of Benjamin. So when he's bragging about himself and listing all of his qualifications on why, if your own righteousness could save you, he would be saved. And then he says, none of that really counts, though, because it's not your own righteousness that saves you, it's Christ's. But when he's listing his qualifications, he says, I'm a son of the tribe of Benjamin, a Pharisees, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But, Paul, who wrote most of the New Testament and was probably the greatest missionary and one of the most influential men in history after Jesus Christ, was also from the tribe of Benjamin. So that's another feather in his cap, I guess. Judah? Yeah. Yeah, so the southern kingdom gets called Judah because that's geographically, they have the larger chunk of land, and again, they're following the Davidic line, and David's from the tribe of Judah. So they're just known as Judah, and they end up being called the Jews. But it really was Judah and Benjamin were the two tribes in the southern kingdom. And then the other 10 are all in the north, and they get scattered and lost during the Assyrian exile. Yes, although, yeah. So it's the issue is so there's a lot more people who are descended from Israelites than we would necessarily recognize, because you do have the 10 tribes get scattered, and we don't really know where they end up. Unless you're Mormon, then a bunch of them built boats and sailed to America and became the Native Americans. But for everyone else, the 10 tribes get scattered during the Assyrian exile, and that's what that's the difference between how Assyria and Babylon work in their exiles. Babylon is much more kind of empire building y, and so Babylon allows people to maintain their culture. They still remove them from their homeland so that they're demoralized, but they're moved as a group so they can maintain their own independent culture within themselves, and then they just try to influence that culture to be sympathetic with Babylon. So that's why you have people like Daniel, who is I forget if he's Judah or Benjamin, but Daniel is raised up in the under the king's tutelage and kind of as an ambassador between the king and the rest of the Jewish people. But he's educated in the Babylonian system, and the idea is to make him sympathetic to Babylon through that schooling, so then he can go to the Jews, and he's one of them, and he understands their culture, but he can be like, hey guys, Babylon's not so bad. We shouldn't ever plan a rebellion against them. They're actually pretty good to us, so don't have any thoughts about rebellion. That's Babylon's view of how you do empire building in exiles. Assyria wants to completely eradicate individual cultures and make it into a homogenous Assyrian mess. So in Assyria, exiles people, they don't let them stay in groups and maintain their own unique culture. They spread them out all over the place. So when the 10 northern tribes get exiled by Assyria, they're spread all throughout the empire, and they lose a lot of their unique culture because they're intermarried with all the other people. They're raised up around other cultures, where it becomes kind of a melting pot type of idea and becomes kind of this homogenous Assyrian culture, and they lose sight of the fact that they're Issacharites or Reubenites, or Philistines or Moabites or whatever. They all just kind of become Assyrian subjects eventually. So this is ultimately the conflict between the Sumerians and the Jews, or the Samaritans and the Jews in the New Testament is Samaria was the capital of the northern kingdom, and then it gets taken over by Assyria. And so you have some people who are descended from the Israelites in Samaria, but they've also been mixed in with all the other nations that Assyria had conquered. And so the Samaritans are like, hey, we descended from the tribes. We don't necessarily know which tribe we belong to, but I know we're descended from them, so we're just as legitimate as you guys. And the Jews are over here being like, no, we're pure-blooded Jews. You've got like Moabite and Canaanite and Philistine and whatever else mixed in with you. You're dirty mutts now. You can't trace your lineage back to a specific tribe or anything. You're just like, oh, we're Israelite somehow, but you don't really know what tribe you are. You've got everyone else mixed in with you. You don't count. That's why the Jews don't like the Samaritans. But you see, too, their culture has changed because the Samaritans were sort of Jewish in their religion, but they didn't recognize the entirety of scriptures. They really only, I think they only held to the Torah. They didn't believe the words of any of the other prophets as being scripture. They kind of make up their own worship practices because they don't go to the temple to worship with the Jews. They're just like, we got this mountain here. That works just as well. That's what the Samaritan woman talking to Jesus is asking about. It's like, the Jews say we have to worship in the temple to worship God. We say we can worship on this mountain, and that's just as good for God. What do you think? And then Jesus is like, there's going to be a day where it doesn't really matter where you worship because the whole world's going to be under God. And she doesn't really understand what he's saying at that point. But yeah, that's the background of the conflict between the Jews and the Samaritans. I'm going on all sorts of tangents today. Yeah. So yeah, getting back to your original point, yeah, there's lots of people who they have Israelite DNA, probably more people than we realize, but because the 10 tribes get so scattered and they're not really allowed to maintain their own cultures anymore, they lose the ability to trace their lineage in the same way that the Judeans and the Benjaminites can. And again, too, they're not as pure. They're mixed in with all these other civilizations. And so I'm sure there are genetic markers that 23andMe or whatever can track back to it. But for like people who really care about genetics, they probably say that it's too mixed in to really count. I guess, yeah, I'm not phrasing it very well, but yeah, yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, there's various groups that can trace their lineage up to into Israel one way or another. But we call them the 10 lost tribes because they did get so scattered and so mixed in. We don't necessarily know. They don't have as many records to keep their lineage going the way that the Judeans and the Benjaminites and the Levites who lived among them were able to do. Um, so yeah, there's lots more people out there who have Israelite DNA than they probably realize, um, because of how everything gets mixed up at a certain point in history. But again, it's not really about the genetics. That's kind of the point that Jesus makes when he's arguing with the Jews a couple of times where they're like, oh, we're children of Abraham. And Jesus is like, I could make children of Abraham out of these stones if I wanted to. It's not a question of genetics, it's a question of faith. So, yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the globalization and yeah, and that's why we always have the culture wars going on too. That's just basic Marxism. You destroy the individual culture so that you can make it into one giant homogenous mass. Um, we're really going to get pulled off of YouTube. Yeah, yeah, but you're not allowed to talk about it. Yeah. What did you do? All right, let's get back on track. 19. The blessing given to Ruth was well intentioned for the farming society they lived in. Would the same blessing be desired by you today? Why or why not? Yeah. So Walt would love lots more kids if he were younger and able to keep up with them. But yeah, Walt loves kids. He wants to have big kids, and it's the author of this study, I believe, lives in Southern California, so it's a bit of a different atmosphere than out here where we are rural and we are more farming oriented. But yeah, for people in the cities, like I was talking about, we do have this cultural narrative that you don't really want a big family. They're going to be too expensive. The house, you can't get the housing to fit them all in. Everyone should, you want to have 2.5 kids and a white picket fence. That's the American dream. No more than that. No, big families are too much of a hassle. Um, yeah, yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's other factors. There's other factors going into MGTOW as well. But yeah, we do have this cultural attack against the nuclear family. That was when BLM first popped up. Black Lives Matter, not Bureau of Land Management. Have to specify that because we're in Nevada. Yeah. Um, but when the Black Lives Matter website first went up there and they had their list of goals, one of the goals was to dismantle the nuclear family because they're all Marxists, and that's one of the first steps in Marxism is you dismantle the nuclear family because family relies on each other. If you get rid of the family, then people have to be more reliant on the state. And if you look at the Soviet Union, that's what they did. They completely disincentivized the family. Like you have a family and you produce kids for the good of Mother Russia, but they're not really your family. The state is your family. And so the emphasis was you socialize with your workmates and your comrades instead of spending time at home. You go home to eat food and make more kids for Mother Russia, but you spend your free time hanging out with your workmates because your workmates are your family because you all worship the state together. Um, yeah, Big Brother. And it. And again, you look at this big cultural narrative. That's what we have. We've got. I just read an article this last week of someone saying that we need to, there's various ways that the tax code does give you advantages if you're married. There's also lots of ways that it can hurt you. But somebody was writing an article saying we need to get rid of all the tax codes that give benefits to people for being married because it's limiting white colonial power structure nonsense stuff. But there's people who are arguing against the idea of marriage. You've got people who are saying, we shouldn't make marriage vows till death do you part. Marriage should be like a 3-year contract, so you can enjoy the relationship and then you can move on to someone else when you get bored, and it's already there so you don't have to get the divorce lawyers involved because you've already signed the contract and it's already set up for when the contract expires. We got the whole surrogacy industry where kids are just a luxury item you order for yourself if you're bored, like a pet. They're not a gift from God in a loving married relationship that you actually have to make sacrifices for, and you're glad to do it because they're your kids and you actually care about and love them as your kids and not as a status symbol. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So we're in this clown world, and yeah, like you said, they're trying to destabilize all of the traditional structures we have so that they can impose their new glorious revolution upon us all. Sorry, DL, you've had your hand up for a while. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, again, yeah, she does have like all of the structures that society says, oh, you can't have kids until these things are in place. Ruth does have them in place. She does have land now. She does have uh, a seemingly well-off husband. Like he has lots of workers who are working for him, and he seems to have had a good harvest that he's able to lavish all those gifts on Ruth in the first place. So she does have land. She does have money. She does have the backing to be able to support a family. So of course she should be wanting to have a nice big family because she can support it too. But yeah, just culturally, they had their priorities more in place back then, I think, than a lot of society does today. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like I said, the study is written in Southern California, where I think the implication is like, yeah, we don't really think about wanting lots of kids, and then we're reading it here in rural Nevada, where it's like, yeah, we want lots of kids. We need help out in the fields. But that is closer to what the situation is in Ruth. They're in a rural agrarian farming community, so yeah, yeah, yeah. The environment helps. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 And again, that's kind of that's the Israelite model. The land is supposed to stay within the family. You're supposed to have heirs who will take over the land for you. And in America, we're in our wonderful post-Christian society. That cultural narrative is no, farming is bad. It's low status. You don't want to become a farmer. You need to go get a white collar job somewhere. And so the kids grow up and they leave the farm. They have no interest in taking it over. And so now there's no family left to inherit. And so the land just gets sold off to whatever corporation wants to buy it because yeah, there's no one to redeem the land now and has to go to someone. So yeah. Yeah. So now my grandkids can grow up eating cricket paste. Woohoo! All right, we'll try to push through and at least finish lesson 6 today. 20. Oh, fun. Who is the father of Perez, and what great honor was given to the father of Perez? All right, let's do this. So Perez is the son of Judah and Tamar by a really, really, really bizarre family dynamic. So Judah has. All right, Caesar, you may have to do earmuffs for this. Judah has a son. I forget his first son's name. He marries Tamar. They die childless. So then that son's brother is Onan, who then has to do the Levirate marriage thing, and he's supposed to marry Tamar and produce an heir. Onan is greedy. He wants to use Tamar for marital relations, but he doesn't want to produce an heir because if an heir is produced, then the inheritance goes to the heir. Onan wants to keep the inheritance for himself, so he tries to avoid getting Tamar pregnant through the pull-out method, and God executes him for it, for spilling his seed. That's where we get the term onanism, if you're familiar with that. And then I think Judah's out of sons at that point. So Tamar comes up to Judah and she's like, hey, you need to get, or no, he has a third son who won't marry Tamar. And Judah's like, I don't want you marrying Tamar because the last two sons I had who married Tamar ended up dead. I don't want you ending up dead either. And Tamar's like, hey, Judah, you're supposed to you're supposed to make your third son marry me to produce an heir so that I'm not just a poor childless widow for the rest of my life. And Judah's like, no, I don't want to do that. So then Judah goes on the road. He's traveling somewhere, I forget. Tamar goes on the road and she disguises herself as a prostitute, and Judah purchases her for her services as a prostitute. Except he doesn't have any money on him, and so he's like, "Here's my signet ring. I'll pay you back later." And he goes by his journeys. He comes home, and all of his servants are like, "Hey, Tamar is pregnant and unmarried. What's going on here?" And Judah's like, "Oh, we better punish her for getting pregnant out of wedlock." And then Tamar comes up. He's like, "The father of the child gave me this ring." And Judah's like, "Okay." So then he ends up marrying Tamar, and you have this really weird, bizarre Levirate marriage thing happening with his daughter-in-law. And from them come Perez, who then becomes the largest of the sub-tribes that descend from Judah, and then he ends up also being in the genealogy of Christ. So really, really weird family dynamics happening in the Old Testament. But it shows that Jesus can come from really, really weird and messed up situations, and that's kind of his thing. He comes from weird and messed up situations, and he redeems them. Even though Judah and his whole family is really messed up, God is still able to use that to give us Jesus, who can redeem everybody and get those sins forgiven, which I'm Lutheran, so I have to take my pot shots at the Roman Catholics wherever I can. This whole idea that Mary had to be born sinless because Jesus couldn't have come out of a sinful woman, I'm just like, have you seen his genealogy? That's his whole thing. He comes from what's broken and he makes it new. So, yeah, again, you yeah. But yeah, again, his whole well, not the whole lineage, but a fair amount of his lineage is messed up. You got this weird stuff happening with Judah. Rahab is in the line; she was a prostitute. Some of the kings of Israel who descended from David were not very good, but he still descends from them. Ruth is a Moabite who are supposed to be cursed, but she's still in the family line. That's the whole thing. Is Jesus comes from what's broken and he fixes it and makes it new. So the people who are like, "Oh, Mary had to be perfectly sinless because Jesus couldn't have been born from a woman who never committed a sin." And again, it's just like that's kind of his thing. So yeah, I don't hold to the Immaculate Conception. And again, the Immaculate Conception is the belief that Mary was born perfect, not the virgin birth. That's a separate doctrine. But people don't know that and they confuse them. So when I say I oppose the Immaculate Conception, they think I'm denying the virgin birth. I'm not. They're different doctrines. But yeah, the great honor given to the father of Perez, Judah, is that, again, Perez becomes an ancestor to Jesus, which means Judah is an ancestor to Jesus, and that's in all sorts of Christological prophecies. He would be the Lion of Judah. That's part of the blessing when Jacob is giving all of his sons a blessing before he dies. That's part of the blessing he gives to Judah, is that your brothers are going to submit to you, because Jesus is going to come from that, and obviously he's the King of Kings. All right, what blessing do we enjoy today that is far greater than any blessing in the Old Testament? We're short on time, so I'll tell you this is our Sunday school answer of Jesus. The Old Testament, they had to take it on faith that a Messiah would come. They had to have hope in that which was not yet fulfilled. That's the whole Hebrews 11 thing. Abraham was blessed because of his faith that God's promise would be fulfilled, but he didn't actually get to see that happen in his lifetime. We who are post-resurrection, we have the benefit of knowing that Jesus was born and that he lived and died for us, so that we have the knowledge of the forgiveness of our sins. So we're better off than anyone in the Old Testament because we have this fuller revelation from God, and we can see how everything in the Old Testament was leading up to Jesus and everything that comes from that. But even then, we still have an even greater future to look forward to when the fullness of God is revealed in the eschaton, when the kingdom of heaven comes in full restoration. But yeah, that's our greater blessing, is that we have this knowledge of Christ that people in the Old Testament, they had prophecies they had to try to fit together, but they didn't have the full picture of it yet. And then we know after his resurrection, it says that Jesus opens up the scripture to the disciples and he reveals how everything is pointed to him. And that's when the Holy Spirit comes and gives us faith, and we can understand how everything fits together. That's the greater benefit we have post-resurrection that they did not have in the Old Testament. Make sense? All right, last question. Sorry, we're a little over time, but we'll get through this last question and start on lesson 7 next week. What future event in history would result in Boaz and Ruth becoming famous in Bethlehem? Yeah, Jesus and David too. But yeah, mostly Jesus. And then Micah 5:2 is where we have that prophecy that Jesus would be born in Bethlehem, Ephrathah. So you can look that up if you want to get the exact wordage. All right, that is lesson 6. So next week we'll start lesson 7. Since we have been doing 2 weeks per lesson, I don't know. Lesson 7's kind of shorter, so we might get through it all next week. But at this point, I'm kind of anticipating we'll spend 2 weeks on 7, as we have with the others, and then that will bring us to the 11th, which is when we start the Augsburg Confession study. So we're probably going to spend 2 weeks on lesson 7, and then we'll go into the Augsburg Confession. But again, when you're out in the fellowship hall or whatever, talk up the Augsburg Confession, please. I want to have as many as possible here for it, because it's really good to study. There's lots of really good theological steps, and of course I have to say that I'm a systematician. But again, that's the document where we said this is what it means to be a Lutheran. If we're a Lutheran congregation, I feel like we should all be at least somewhat familiar with what we actually believe, teach, and confess. So yeah, if we could try to do whatever we can to bump up numbers for that, I'd appreciate it. Yes, Mary? I think we do already. Yeah. Yeah, new Sunday morning Bible study will begin on September 11th on the Augsburg Confession. Please join us for breakfast at 8. So yeah, it's in the bulletin, and we have to run it through a separate printer if we want color, and that's a whole other thing. So yeah, sorry, I'm not. Yeah, if you can convince Linda to spend the time to do that, if you want to volunteer to do it yourself, but yeah. But yeah, I started announcing it after the service last week too, so I'll do what I can. But yeah, it's a really fun document. We'll get to take lots of pot shots at the Catholics and the Anabaptists and the Calvinists. It's so much fun. Yeah. Steve's becoming Lutheran, so it's fine. But yeah, it's like after at the end of every article, it's like, oh, and also we condemn the Anabaptists and the Calvinists and the so and so for these reasons. And yeah, it's fine. Yeah, that all falls under Calvinism. Yeah. All right, we're past time. Sorry, but you guys got me distracted, so I blame you. I'll pray us out, and then I need to get ready for the service. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the faithfulness of Ruth and Boaz, that through them, not only do we get the coming of Jesus as his ancestors, but we also again have this model of redemption, so that studying their actions can give us a better appreciation of what Jesus has done for us. We ask that you would be with us as we continue to study these revelations about him, and be with us as we prepare to receive the blessings of forgiveness won through him by the word and sacrament of the divine service. Please keep us safely in your hands until we can once again gather in your name, in which we pray.